I wanted to provide you an update on the events that occurred concerning the arrest of Jamal Hudson that occurred earlier this year. I believe it was in May. Recently, the administrative investigation, which I initiated in this case, was completed. This allows for us to release the details concerning the events of this case. This video was created, and we're going to show it to you on the television screen here, to show not only an overview of the events, but details which provide a comprehensive understanding of what happened at the Caroline Luxury Apartments on May 27th of 2024 during the follow-up investigation. During the video presentation, you will see a body-worn camera and surveillance video which will show facts that are not yet known to the public. The investigation in this video overview includes the cell phone footage that was originally posted online as well. When examined in slower detail, the videos show facts that you might have missed when viewed in real time. Keep in mind, videos are obviously two-dimensional and cannot tell us everything that we need to know. However, body-worn cameras are sometimes limited in view, especially when the officer is close to the subject being addressed. Also, video can never replicate human physiology and what an officer is experiencing as they grapple with a suspect, such as muscles tensing and beginning to pull away. I want to play the video for you, and we can provide to you later if you'd like, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. You'll see me narrating the video as it goes through. We've tried very hard to construct the video where it answers all your questions. You'll see it as a timeline and a compilation, as I said, a body cam video, the video that was released online, and security camera video. I will tell you that the security camera video, that is the overhead view, does not have sound. So if there's an opportunity other than me talking in the background, there's no sound associated with that video. So we'll make the raw footage available to you if you so desire to have it. It is about 13 minutes long. But it lays the predicate as to why we were out there from the very beginning all the way to the very end. So with that, we will play the video. I'm Chief Sam Taylor with the Lakeland Police Department, and today I'll brief you on the events that occurred on May 27, 2024 at the Caroline Luxury Apartments, which resulted in the arrest of a 16-year-old male subject. After a thorough investigations have been completed by our Criminal Investigations Unit and our Office of Professional Standards, I can now discuss the details which will allow for a better understanding of the circumstances which led to the officer's actions taken during this arrest. I want to begin by saying that our agency reviews all protective actions taken by our officers and takes the use of protective action very, very seriously. With each incident, investigators examine all evidence available before making an informed conclusion. Our officers are tasked with making difficult decisions every day during the course of their duties, and sometimes tasked to use protective action. There are many factors which an officer must consider prior to and during the application of any protective action. Therefore, we need to be careful and not rely on a quick view of an incomplete single video to make a conclusion. On May 27th at approximately 5:06 p.m., our agency received a call from a resident requesting officers to respond to the Caroline Luxury Apartments on Griffin Road. A resident reported a group of teenagers and young adults being disruptive in the pool area, acting rowdy and using profanity in the presence for young children and others. The resident also advised she asked the group to calm down or leave, but they refused. Their behavior continued and actually escalated. At approximately 5:32 p.m., our first officer arrived at the apartments, with the second officer arriving a few moments later. After meeting with the caller at the clubhouse area to confirm her account of the actions reported, the primary officer made his way to the pool area. The primary officer spent the next 15 minutes trying to determine who lived at the apartment complex and who had the right to be utilizing the swimming pool. During this time, the officer was provided multiple conflicting statements and false information. One person provided their information, which actually later was determined to be a false name. The individual was trespassed, but immediately said she would come back to the property as soon as the officers left. At no time did the remainder of the group attempt to leave the pool. It was determined during the follow-up investigation that none of the 5 persons reported were residents of the complex, nor valid guests who were actually allowed to be using the pool. During this time, the officer asked at least 5 times for the subjects to leave the pool area. Believing the call was over, the 2 officers suspended the recording of their body cameras as they believed the group was finally coming inside to gather their belongings and leave the property. Seeing that a couple members of the group began verbally escalating the situation again, the secondary officer reactivated his body camera while the primary officer was standing by waiting for the group to leave. During this time, the male subject and one of the females made their way to the exit to leave. However, before exiting through the door, the male subject returned to grab another item from a table inside, and the female also turned away from the exit and moved back inside the portico. This was the point where the events took a different turn and the incident began to further escalate. The male subject was seen looking in the direction of the initial caller, making inappropriate statements, shaking his head, and making gestures. Seeing this escalation, the primary officer leaned over in an attempt to get the male subject to direct his attention to the officer and not the caller. The male subject responded by putting his hand up over the facial area of the officer and stated, quote, "I don't have to talk to you," unquote. The male subject then moved around the primary officer, walked closer to the caller, and continued making disparaging comments to the caller, including calling her a white Karen. He continued to curse at the caller and asked, "Do you have something to say to me?" Based on the subject's behavior and size, the caller became intimidated and fearful for her safety. At this point, the officer was obligated to step in for the safety of the caller. It should be noted that the male weighed approximately 374 pounds, outweighing the caller and each officer by 200 pounds individually. Officers have now spent approximately 18 minutes attempting to get this group to leave peacefully. However, the male chose not to leave and instead exhibited behaviors that caused safety concerns for the caller. The officer, in one final attempt, gave the male a lawful verbal command to leave or he would be arrested. Based on the subject's failure to comply with the officer's commands and the subject's aggressive actions towards the caller, the primary officer made the decision to place the male under arrest. As you can see in the video, the primary officer grabbed the subject's right arm in an attempt to place him into custody. The officer also verbally told the subject he was under arrest. The subject actively resisted by snatching his arm from the officer's grip. The primary officer then attempted a soft, empty hand control technique by grabbing the subject's left arm, attempting to put his hand behind his back while pushing him towards the wall to gain control. The subject continued to actively and physically resist by attempting to pull his arm from the officer's grasp, and he began flailing his arms toward the primary officer. The backup secondary officer immediately attempted to stun the subject, but due to the struggle, the secondary officer was unable to effectively discharge the taser. The taser did not discharge and therefore had no effect on the subject. The subject continued to physically resist both officers. The subject and the floor of the clubhouse were wet from the pool water, which significantly increased the difficulty of controlling the subject. The primary officer had now made 2 attempts to turn the subject to face the wall with an arm manipulation technique, but was unsuccessful. The resistant subject continued to brace and tense his body and refused the commands to put his hands behind his back. The subject flailed his arms and struck the primary officer in the face. During the active struggle, the male was seen grabbing at the officer's police radio. As the officer struggled to gain control of the subject's arms, the officer delivered an empty hand strike to the subject's head. In return, the subject grabbed the entire facial area of the officer. The subject again raised his arm in resistance and struck the primary officer's face, causing the bill of the officer's hat to be pushed down into the officer's face. In response, the officer delivered another empty hand strike. The subject continued to aggressively resist by reaching around the officer and attempting to grab onto the officer's duty belt. The secondary officer attempted to assist the primary officer by grabbing the subject while also trying to keep his attention on the other four individuals crowded nearby who yelled and screamed at them. The primary officer once again attempted an armbar manipulation to gain control of the subject with no effectiveness. Because this was unsuccessful, the subject grabbed the officer's front pants pocket, pulling the officer towards him, shifting the officer's body stance, all while continuing to strike at the officer. During the struggle, the primary officer continued to give verbal commands for the subject to put his hands behind his back, to which the male responds with, quote, "No, bitch," unquote. The primary officer delivered another strike in an effort to break the subject's hold on his uniform. Once the subject broke his hold on the officer, he pulled back and assumed a fighting stance. The subject balled his fists up and shook them while yelling, quote, "Let's go," unquote, challenging the primary officer in his continued violent resistance. The secondary officer then delivered an empty hand strike, which had no effect, as the subject went on to intentionally strike the secondary officer with his right hand. The secondary officer delivered another empty hand strike, and because of the secondary officer's actions, the primary officer was allowed time to disengage and ready his taser. The primary officer then deployed his taser, which was effective, and the subject fell to the floor. The subject finally began to comply, and all protective actions immediately ceased. Officers were able to then handcuff the subject and escort him to the patrol vehicle for transport. This incident did not need to happen, and this incident would not have happened had the subject simply complied with the officer's lawful command. A few things to point out. First, this group should never have been trespassing at a place they were not lawfully allowed to be. Second, this group should have left when asked to do so by a resident of the community. Third, some members of the group complied with the officer's commands to leave the area. All members of the group should have followed his command. Fourth, this group was given more than 7 verbal instructions to leave the area, to which they did not comply. Fifth, the subject should not have decided to turn around from the exit and continue escalating the situation by approaching the caller. The officer cannot ignore a threat. He has a duty to react and intercede when he perceives a threat of danger. Finally, once he was advised he was under arrest, the subject should have followed the lawful commands of the primary officer instead of choosing to physically resist. These officers tried multiple verbal commands, all of which were ignored. Given the imposing size of the subject, the primary officer then attempted soft control and joint manipulation techniques, which were not effective. I know much focus has been placed on the subject's age, but this individual outweighed the officers individually by over 200 pounds. Once the subject's actions demonstrated that he had no plans of being taken into custody, the officers then resorted to strikes and the use of a taser. As you can see, once the subject complied with the officer's commands, the use of force immediately ceased. The use of protective action in this incident has been thoroughly reviewed by our criminal investigations detectives and our Office of Professional Standards. The protective actions taken by the officers was found to be within our agency's policies and follows the textbook training guidelines set forth by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Standards and Trainings Commission and federal agencies. Our agency goes above and beyond the required minimum training standards, including annual refresher training, which exceeds the minimum requirements. You may not agree with what an officer is telling you, but you are required to follow the lawful commands. At no time are you permitted to physically strike a police officer. If you believe that you have been wrongly arrested, there are certainly avenues you can take to file a complaint with the Lakeland Police Department, the State Attorney's Office, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and even the FBI. There is no provision in the Constitution that allows a person to actively and physically resist arrest. No officer that I'm aware of comes to work looking for an opportunity to involve themselves in a fight. However, they are trained to respond to different levels of physical resistance, and I expect them to do so. In this event, the officer's use of protective action was appropriate, and they acted and reacted as they are trained to do. All right, and as I said, we'll make that video available to you if you so desire. I wanted to show a photograph of the fence area. I don't know if you can get a good view of that, but you can see the bushes and the links that the apartment complex was going to try to prohibit trespassers from coming into the pool. They had a problem at this location with trespassers and unwanted guests. We had more than a dozen calls out there for trespassing, swimming in the pool, and other type calls. So they put this fence up. You can see the damage to the fence, and then they planted some bushes that had some thorns on them to try to keep the folks out, keep unwanted guests out. The pool was for residents and guests only. So, and I get it. It was hot, and it's not obviously the young folks were there swimming and trying to cool off, but they were not invited guests. They were not allowed to be there, and they should have left when the officers asked them to do so. Once the initial cell phone video was posted online, I'll make a couple comments and I'll answer your questions. Was posted on the social media, the reportee received numerous threats. I want to talk a moment about the reportee that we blurred out. She received numerous threats to the point that she no longer lives at that location. She actually had to move. She was very hesitant even to participate in this investigation. However, she felt it was important to ensure that all the facts came out. Some of those involved that you saw there took a photograph of her and posted it online, I would assume, so that they would attempt to get other people to harass her. She did nothing wrong. In fact, the property had encouraged other residents to report such incidents where non-residents were at the location. They actually had established a program to where you could have a band. If it was a guest or something, you were allowed to have a certain number of guests and you would issue the band there for your guest. The young man refused to identify himself or provide any information. We had no idea it was a juvenile until later we got the information from him and how old he was. So to me, the age is somewhat irrelevant. Let me remind you about some of the incidents that we've had here lately. We had a 13-year-old shoot at one of our police officers last year, shot him in the foot. We certainly had a young man that had just turned 18 take several shots at two of our officers last week. And of course, we all know what happened in Georgia just yesterday, where the 14-year-old shot and killed about 4 folks in the high school there. So in this case, we had a 16-year-old who chose to physically resist the officers and ignore the officers' lawful commands. This young man outweighed these officers by more than double their weight individually, almost 400 pounds. Those are just the facts, and the fact that he was willing to resist and actively fight the police officers until he was tased. And then once he was tased, the fight was over. So with that, I've got a couple other things that I want to say, but I'll save those till the very end, and I'll answer any questions that you have.
What is your reaction to, as we know, the state attorney decided not to pursue charges
Sure.
Against the juvenile, but what is your reaction to that?
Sure. I had a conversation with Brian Haas, our state attorney, and he certainly relayed to me that the officer certainly had the probable cause to make an arrest. He agreed by watching the video that they had enough probable cause to make the arrest. The prosecution decisions are the decisions that they make based on how many times the young man had been arrested, what his criminal history was, how many cases they had pending in the juvenile section. So that'd be a question I would direct to him. He did tell me, though, however, to relay that, based on our conversation, he certainly agrees that there was probable cause to make the arrest.
And the last time that we were here, I believe, in terms of, I think you made a comment about how you're moving away from officers punching.
Sure.
So that, can you expand on that?
Sure. It's certainly a technique that's trained in the police academy, and I've got the literature, and if you're interested in the literature, we can provide that to you in the basic training academy. It's something that we train for. You certainly can't ask an officer that and take that option away from them, because sometimes folks tackle us and get us on the ground, and that's the only option the officer has to get people off of them is to punch them. And the facial area is a legitimate target area for punches. The only place that we're trying not to hit them unless deadly force is required, according to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, is the neck. But other than that, punches are a legitimate defensive tactic, and that we get trained on in the basic academy, and we train on it here. Now, I will tell you, just like I said last week or earlier this week, it's one of those things that looks awful. It's lawful, but it looks awful, right? That's not a pretty sight. There's no such thing as a pretty fight. You've heard the sheriff say it, and I've said it before. No such thing as a pretty fight. There's no referee standing there. There's nobody ringing a bell saying, okay, you guys go to your neutral corners. That is a street fight. And I would suspect that those of us in here that have been involved in fights, and I have been involved in fights, it's not pretty and it's ugly. And now we're going to put them on videos. We're going to put them on body cameras, and you're going to put them on cell phone videos. Everybody gets a copy of it, where 20, 30 years ago, the fight still occurred just as many times. They just weren't on video. So now we're having to show them on television, and everybody gets an opportunity to opine, and everybody that's the keyboard warriors get an opportunity to say, well, the officer should have done this and the officer should have done that. Look, I'm taking applications. If someone feels like they could have done it better, come on down. Put a uniform on and let's go. So we have more effective options now. We didn't have tasers 20, 30 years ago. We had nightsticks, right? And even that looks terrible, right? With the experience of 35 years, I don't think that I'm going to go hands-on with a 400-pound young man. I'm just not going to do it. I'm probably going to step back and tase him, first thing, right? But that's 35 years experience talking versus an officer that has 4 years experience. And he had no idea that the young man was going to resist. Just keep that in mind. He's reacting to what this young man is doing. He said, you're under arrest, put your hands behind your back. As far as he knew, the young man was going to turn around and put his hands behind his back. And had he done that, he would have gotten a ticket in a juvenile court with a court date. And that would have been it. But he was reacting to what that young man chose to do. That's a long-winded way of answering your question, but yeah, it looks terrible, but it is a legitimate defensive tactic that I think probably most police chiefs and sheriffs would prefer that we didn't do, because we break our hands when we hit people. It's not super effective, to be honest with you. We give, these guys and gals are out there, these fancy, $1,000, $1,300, $1,400, whatever the cost of these tasers are now. I just prefer they use them. That would be ideal, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't get to them. The second officer you saw there was trying to drive stun him. I was really particular when I used the word drive. It's D-R-I-V-E, but because of the wetness and everything else, he wasn't able to do that. So it doesn't shoot the tasers out. It's just a bunch of shock. But that ended the fight. As soon as we tased him, it ended the fight. We probably wouldn't be here today if we would have just tased him initially. But you know what? Nobody in this room was there. That officer didn't have any idea that he was going to be, the next 3 months of his life was going to be disrupted, because of an action that on a 27-second cell phone video that was put online. So, anything else?
Is he on administrative leave?
He is not. He is not. No. Neither one of the officers are. There's 2 officers there. Look, this is an armed confrontation, right? We know there's at least 2 guns in this fight, right? Each officer has at least 1 gun, and probably more than likely they got more than 1. But we know this is an armed confrontation, and we hear all the time about officers getting involved in confrontations where they get their gun away from them. And now, I'm not saying that was that young man's intent. I don't know what his intent was. I wish he would just got out of the pool and left. That would have been ideal, but he didn't do that. They didn't choose to do that. Some of the group did. They left. They're fine. But some of the group, he in particular didn't choose to do that. So, but I wish he would have. So, all right.
Are there other community pools that kids like this could have gone?
Sure, we have 2 of them. There's Simpson Park. There's a pool up at Simpson Park, and there's one down on the south side, for the north side, and there's one down at Kelly Rec. So there's plenty of, there's 2 locations, and those are huge pools, and they have programs there, Parks and Rec. They have kids from all ages, from the little ones all the way up to the big ones. They're more than welcome to go swim there. So there's no problem with that. So, all right. Well, let me say a couple more things, and then I'll let you guys go. First of all, I appreciate you guys coming out on a Friday afternoon. We really tried not to do this on a Friday, because I know Fridays are, everybody's trying to get into the weekend, but just the logistics, and this is the way it happened. It turned out to be on a Friday, but I was asked last week, I think, or earlier this week, Tuesday, did I think what the the officers did at the time with Antoine Glover pulling him out of the car, if I thought it was reasonable. In fact, one of you in here may have asked me that question. And I gave you an answer that I thought that it was. But in this event, I don't think it's reasonable to knowingly trespass in a facility that you know that you don't live there and you have no right to be there. I don't think that's reasonable. I don't think it's reasonable for you to ignore the request of a resident that her initial request was, hey, I got small kids here. Can you just not cuss? That's all her request was, just not cuss. And in response to that, they cussed at her. So that's when she called the police. So she was just trying to have a day with her kids at the pool. I don't think it's reasonable to continue to trespass after you've been told the police are coming. Look, we were all 16 at one point. I didn't want anything to do with the police. If I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, especially when I knew the police were coming, I'm leaving. So, but for whatever reason, they didn't decide to do that. And then, I don't think it's reasonable, once the police get there, you still don't leave. For whatever reason, you still don't leave. You don't think you have to. I don't think it's reasonable for you to ignore an officer's lawful commands for you to leave. I don't think it's reasonable for you to harass a reportee in front of a police officer. Did you hear what the one lady said to the reportee? We had the reportee blurred out. She said, I'm going to beat your kids too. That's the situation that was going on inside that little portico there. And I certainly don't think it's reasonable to resist and to batter a police officer. I don't think it is. We don't have the right, and I'll say it again. You don't have the right to resist a police officer. You don't. There's no right in the Constitution for you to do that. So, yes, I think the officers were reasonable, absolutely, given the totality of the circumstances. So, with that, you guys have any other questions? All right. Thank you guys for coming out. Appreciate you.